Hello my friends and welcome to my new video. As you can see, I'm sitting here in a French machine gun post. Even though it won't be a French one, machine gun posts will be important today too, so let's start right into it.
Yes, you heard me right, my friends. I know I promised you it would be quicker, but sometimes life has other plans and things take a little more time. In the meantime, I have successfully completed my master thesis. But don't worry, I didn't miss out on building models. I've been working on a new exciting development of my All Quiet on the Western Front diorama, which I presented in the last video. However, I will reveal this to you in a later video. As promised, I also tried my hand at a small interim project, a scene from the First World War. I just wanted to try out a few new techniques here, and that's exactly what we're doing today. We're building a scene in which a Maschinengewehr 08 team is positioned on a destroyed piece of trench. As you can see, I bought a set from ICM for this project. We will use parts of the figures in this set later on, but the Maschinengewehr 08 itself comes from a CMK set and is made of resin. Even if the CMK set is not perfect, I like the level of detail much better compared to the ICM set. However, some of the proportions are extremely strange. In particular, the feet are clearly too big and the muzzle is much too large too. I started by assembling the machine gun. First, I carefully removed the resin parts from the molding blocks. To avoid dust and damage to the parts, I like to use a bowl of water and a fine resin saw. I then used a sharp knife to remove all the casting residue in order to achieve a clean surface and avoid problems later on during assembly. To create the necessary cavities, I had to drill holes in some parts. For larger cavities, I first drilled a hole and then carefully removed the inner part with a knife. For smaller cavities, a fine drill was often sufficient. Particular care was needed here to avoid damaging the thin resin parts. Then I used a saw to remove the muzzle opening of the machine gun, the size of which reminded me of a trumpet, to replace it later with the muzzle openings from copper state models that I still had in reserve for another project. I also shortened the feet of the machine gun with a side cutter, so that they no longer have the proportions of clown's feet. As you can see in this reference picture, the Maschinengewehr 08 has spikes on its feet to anchor it firmly in the terrain. For my diorama scene, I recreated these spikes by cutting small pointed parts from a photo etch parts set and attaching them under the feet of the machine gun with superglue. I also made the carrying loops on the top of the feet using the photo etch set, which is intended for making rifle belts. These adjustments have significantly improved the appearance and effect of these parts, making them both more realistic and historically accurate. Next, I carefully separated the copper state model's machine gun muzzle from its casting block. As you can see, the muzzle was so excited about its newfound freedom that it just made a departure. I then attached the muzzle to the front part of the MG and made sure that no visible adhesive residue remained. To make the machine gun more detailed, I decided to add rivets and bolts. For this I used a photo etch part set from Arba. The fine details in the different sizes of the rivets and bolts in the set allowed me to make the machine gun more authentic. And I love the clean look of models like this, with the additional photo etch details. To round off the construction of the machine gun, I tried to build a bullet belt. At first I tried to use these aftermarket rounds for the MG42, but I soon realized that these aftermarket products were unnecessary and not worth the money. The fine details are hardly recognizable in this size, even on macro cameras, and a thin wire would be absolutely sufficient to display these cartridges. I made the belt from aluminium stamping foil and these cartridges. But nevertheless, at the very end of the build, I decided to use an aftermarket 3D decal, which I will show you in the painting video. Then I started to create the base for my diorama. As so often, I used a large styrofoam block as the base, which I cut to size with a hot wire cutter. I used XPS foam to create a trench on this base, which was badly damaged by artillery fire. To make the trench more realistic, I made sure that the walls are not vertical but slightly angled. This corresponds to the natural erosion processes and gives the trench a more authentic appearance. I determined the depth of the trench using a reference figure on the same scale and compared it with historical images. I took into account that the actual depth will change due to elements such as a fire step, sandbags or the drainage system at the bottom that I will build. However, a rough guide was crucial to ensure realistic proportions. The terrain behind the trench is lowered due to the parapet. I have already achieved this rough terrain structure with the hot wire cutter. I used a hot air gun to shape the crater. When working with the hot air gun and XPS foam, I realized it's the best if the foam at the point where the crater is to be created consists of a single piece. This prevents the foam from hollowing out at the dividing lines, as you will see in a moment. Otherwise, the hot air gun is a great tool for creating realistic craters quickly and easily. After I had removed the unwanted unevenness caused by the hot air gun with a knife, I used a fine lightweight filler from the DIY store. This is an inexpensive alternative to special modeling filler and hardly adds any weight to the diorama. To smooth and adjust the filler on the surface, I took a brush and water and dabbed the filler with it so that its surface was more even. Then I used air drying modeling clay to further refine the basic structure of the crater and the earth that had fallen into the trench. By dusting the work surface with talcum powder or baby powder, I was able to prevent the modeling clay from sticking to the surface. I then rolled out the modeling clay roughly, applied it to the prepared area and modeled it with my hands. The crater is undoubtedly a centerpiece of this diorama. It is not only its central visual focal point, but also a crucial element in conveying the destructive force of the action. Craters are a characteristic feature of First World War battlefields and contribute significantly to the atmosphere of such a scene. With my last project, the All Quiet on the Western Front diorama, I realized it is not so easy to realistically depict the depth and complexity of a crater, which is why this process should be given importance. Reference pictures clearly show how varied and detailed these structures can be. To make the transitions between the trench and the collapsed earth clean, I removed excess modeling clay with a knife before it dried. This allowed me to create clear edges and create space in a flat surface for the planks and other trench structures that I will build in the future. To increase the dynamics of the scene, I added a tree stump that was partially destroyed by the explosion. The idea is that part of the tree trunk protrudes over the crater, emphasizing the force of the explosion. I'm aware that such a constellation is perhaps not quite as likely in reality, but I think it makes the scene more dramatic. This effect draws the viewer even more into the events. Then I added Smart Mud from VMS to the base, a product that provides an excellent base for creating muddy to dry soil and building the drainage system of the trench. I was inspired by numerous reference pictures and the book Modeling World War I Trench Warfare by Andy Belzey, which I can recommend to any World War I modeler. To make corrugated metal sheets, I used aluminium stamping foil and this 3D printed bending tool, which is specifically designed for bending corrugated metal on the scale. This tool makes it possible to bend the foil precisely and repeatably into the desired corrugated shape. Alternatively, a similar bending tool can be made using simple materials such as styrene rods. To reinforce the trench walls, I cut thin beams from balsa wood and integrated them into the trench as supports. The design of trenches in the First World War depended on many factors, including the respective military strategy and the available resources. While the French often relied on makeshift solutions as they expected their own troops to advance quickly, other sides built sophisticated trench systems. My diorama is intended to depict such an ideally constructed trench, which actually hardly ever occurred, as the trench that was built today could already be destroyed tomorrow. An important component of such a trench is the drainage system, which significantly improved the living conditions of the soldiers and prevented them from having to move around in a flooded trench. When designing the trench system, I realized, especially in contrast to more quiet on the Western Front diorama concept, that open trenches where only one trench wall is modeled offer numerous advantages. On the one hand, it makes it easier to paint interior walls as you can easily reach all areas with a brush and airbrush, and on the other hand, you can see what is happening in the trench and all the details much better. Secondly, it stimulates the imagination of the viewer, who can complete the curves of the trench themselves. However, for larger scenes such as my All Quiet on a Western Front diorama, I would also show part of the other trench wall so that the viewer has a reference point for completing the trench in his imagination. But also leave a large part of the trench at the edge of the diorama and open. I used thin veneer panels to construct the duckboards. I cut these into suitable pieces and then attached them to the prepared substructure using superglue. By using veneer, I was able to achieve a realistic representation of the wooden planks. To give the walls a realistic base for the earth layer, I used the paste Terrain's Muddy Ground from AK Interactive. This material adheres excellently to vertical surfaces and enables a detailed design. I pressed pieces of styrene rods into the damp mud as a base for the wicker walls. These serve as a frame for the later wicker work. First, however, I wanted to integrate the floor of the fire step, which is why I built a separate duckboard and integrated it into the trench. As is so often the case, designing this diorama was a journey into the past for me. I studied the living conditions of soldiers in the First World War intensively and tried to recreate them in my model. I was particularly impressed by how much creativity the soldiers used to build their positions, despite the constant shelling in the limited and difficult conditions. Then I wanted to add the detail of the nail heads on the duckboards. At first I had decided to use photo etch parts, as I thought that making such small nail heads from stamping foil would not be possible as they only have a diameter of 0.3 mm. However, after successfully punching some nail heads using the blunt side of a 0.3 mm drill, I was surprised at how good the results turned out. Compared to the photo etch parts, the self-made nail heads are of course much cheaper and offer the same quality. In contrast to smooth surfaces such as plastic, wood requires a slightly more generous application of adhesive. Due to the absorbent properties of wood, the adhesive is absorbed quickly, which is why you have to apply a little more than you would with plastic, as so much adhesive would lead to unsightly adhesive residue. To reinforce the trench walls on the other side, I decided to use the classic First World War element, chicken wire. I built a simple frame from veneer and glued a piece of photo-etched wire to it. It looks as if the wall reinforcement comes from the chicken fence of the nearest farm. Then I also damaged the frame, as this was damaged by the artillery impact. Then I made the wicker walls, which are based on historical models. Many soldiers in the First World War used simple materials such as branches and twigs to secure their trenches. By weaving willow rods or other flexible materials, they created stable yet flexible walls that were better able to withstand the vibrations of explosions than solid materials. I tried to imitate this technique in my model by using styrene rods as the weaving material. By simply crossing the rods, I gradually wove a dense wall and glued each layer of ordinary thin modeling styrene glue. This technique is similar to weaving a basket and requires a little patience. I snipped off the ends towards the end of the diorama, while I bent the ends towards the crater with tweezers so that it looks as if the force of the impact had pushed the branches into the trench. After I had applied a layer of VMS Smart Mud to the entire diorama, it was time to design the sandbags. For these I opted for Magic Sculpt resin from Green Stuff World. This resin is ideal for soft structures and enables a very natural representation of fabric. First I mixed both components of the resin and formed them into a roll. I then cut this roll into pieces about 1 cm in size. When molding the sandbags, it is important to use the right amount of resin. Too much material can mean that the bags end up being too big. I recommend making a few test pieces first to determine the ideal size. Once I had created a rough shape of the bags, I placed them on a diorama and stacked them. It is important not to model too many bags at the same time, as the resin hardens quickly. In this case, I opted for a slightly riskier method and sculpted all bags at once, but this is not necessarily recommended. I did the detail work with silicone brushes. First I smoothed the surface of the bags with a hard silicone brush and then modeled the fabric folds with a softer silicone brush. Creating fabric folds is a matter of practice and requires a little feeling. There's no one-size-fits-all method, as the formation of the folds depends on the position of the bag. In general, I can say that I like to exaggerate the folds, rather than make them too subtle in order to make the effect clearly visible. The folds at the binding point of the sack are particularly important. This is where all the folds come together and give the bag its characteristic shape. Although these folds often look very similar, a lot can be achieved through variations in depth and slight irregularities. By guiding the folds towards the center point and taking into account the materiality of the fabric, a very realistic impression is created. To make the seams of the sandbags as realistic as possible, I first made fine incisions along the seam lines with a sharp knife. Before I modeled the seams with green stuff, I planned my figure's interaction with the diorama in advance. I used the individual body parts of the unfinished figure as stamps to press impressions into the soft sandbags before they hardened. This allowed me to determine exactly where my figure would later sit. Through this careful preparation, I was able to ensure that my figure would later fit perfectly into the scene, a step that is very difficult to make up for later. To give the sandbags an even more realistic look, I opted for particularly fine detail work. I used green stuff to form tiny sausages to represent the seams of the bag. Before I applied these to the sandbags, I moistened the area slightly. This helped me to place the green stuff sausages precisely and to move them again if necessary. I also used VMS sand and ballast trees to ensure that the seams adhered particularly well. Thanks to the capillary effect, this was able to get into the smallest gaps between green stuff and the sandbags and ensure a stable connection. The best thing about it, no unsightly adhesive residue remained visible. To put the finishing touches to the sandbags, I got down to the small details. Firstly, I generously dusted my work surface with baby powder. As before, this is a little trick to prevent the green stuff from sticking to it. I then cut thin strips from the rolled out green stuff. I shaped these into small rolls to represent a typical quad end of a sandbag. Although this is not absolutely necessary, as the ends of the sandbags were often not tied up but simply stuffed under the bag, it gives the bags an additional detail. I attached these rolls to the bags with superglue and then shaped them with a toothpick. This makes the sandbags look even more authentic and detailed. To make the diorama more vivid, I made a blanket out of green stuff. To do this, I rolled out a piece of green stuff again and cut out a rectangle. I then placed this in the trench and formed the typical folds of a folded blanket. Green stuff is ideal for such details as it is both flexible and stable. I can fold and drape the blanket as like without it losing its shape. Then it was time to make the no man's land. I like to use the battlefield of Verdun as reference for a churned up no man's land that is not extremely muddy, as in the Battle of Flanders. To create the no man's land, I first soaked the entire surface with isopropyl alcohol. This ensures that the PVA glue diluted with water, which I will then apply, can flow everywhere, as the surface tension of the glue is dissolved. I then applied several layers of soil from my garden, repeatedly fixing it with isopropyl alcohol and highly diluted PVA glue. Using this technique, I was able to realistically recreate the typical unevenness and depressions of rutted earth of a battlefield. It is also important to soak everything well with glue so that everything is stable after drying out. To make the no man's land more realistic, I combined different materials. In addition to soil from my garden, I also used terrarium sand, which contains soil particles and stones in different sizes and which I therefore like to use. This gives the floor a natural variety. For a more vivid look, I added dried seagrass and roots to represent the vegetation in a devastated area. It was particularly important to me that it didn't look as if the scene didn't continue beyond the boundaries of the diorama. That's why I placed the rice straw, which I used to represent branches, in such a way that they also extend beyond the edge of the diorama and then cut them off at the edge. This gives the impression that the scenery continues. To fix everything securely, I used isopropyl alcohol and PVA glue again and again. To make the trees look more realistic, it was once again time for Magic Sculpt, a material that allowed me to reproduce the bark in great detail. First I applied the Magic Sculpt to the tree trunks and then cut fine vertical grooves with a knife to reproduce the characteristic structure of the bark. I then smoothed the surface with a damp brush to remove excess material and make the bark look more natural. During the First World War, it was vital to observe the enemy without becoming a target yourself. That's why I decided to build a trench periscope from scratch. Leslie Wickers describes impressively in his book about training for the trenches how dangerous it was to stick your head over the parapet. But in this war we soon learned that it was unhealthy to stick your head over the parapet more often than necessary. I want to build a historically accurate periscope as it was used in the First World War. Leslie Wickers describes in his book that the first models were bulky boxes that gave the soldiers a view but also were an easy target. I will take this design as a basis and build my own periscope out of polystyrene and aluminium foil. I decided to use a square hollow tube with a diameter of 4 mm for my replica of a historical trench periscope. I cut it to the desired length and then milled in the characteristic grooves that imitated the individual blocks of the original. I then cut out the openings for the mirrors with a sharp knife and glued them in at an angle. I based my replica for the periscope on a hinged construction. I built a hinge from styrene, aluminium foil and photo-etched parts. Small punched out rivets and rivets from the photo-etched parts set add the finishing touches. Very often the no man's land was not a completely lifeless place. Despite the destruction, plants found their way back. To represent this diversity, I used dried seagrass for grasses. For smaller plants I used photo-etched elements. I bent these and placed them in places where life is making its way. This creates an exciting contrast between destruction and rebirth, although of course I was still striving to achieve the look of the more apocalyptic battlefields. Another indispensable element of a battlefield in the First World War is barbed wire. To depict these deadly entanglements, I bent posts of wire. I used the same technique and the same bending tool that I used from All Quiet on the Western Front diorama. By bending the wires, I was able to realistically recreate the characteristic shape of the barbed wire post. I also added the screw at the bottom end of one of the posts, as this post will not be buried in the ground but will be placed in the diorama as an additional detail. After adding more green stuff blankets to the diorama and especially to the tree trunk, I then proceeded to cover the sides of the diorama. I used wood veneer for this, which I cut to the right size. To attach the veneers securely, I decided to use double-sided adhesive tape. PVA glue would not have been ideal in this case, as it would have caused the veneer to curl. Then I used a rotary tool to adapt the wood veneer paneling perfectly to the shape of my diorama. With the various attachments, I was able to cut and sand the veneer precisely. I also used sandpaper in some places. To make the transitions between the veneer and the diorama look more natural, I covered the edges with earth again. This gives the impression that the diorama extends seamlessly beyond the borders. Once I had designed the landscape with all its details, the base of my diorama was ready and I could devote myself to making the figures. However, to draw full attention to the figures in the scenery, I painted the side walls of the diorama completely black beforehand. A dark background makes the figures and the landscape stand out better and creates an atmospheric depth. To bring my figures to life, I combined figure parts from different ICM sets. This gave me a great variety of poses and expressions. The most challenging part was customizing a figure from a World War II set. For the helmets, I opted for the John Smith Modellbau's German helmets, which have the best M16 helmets on the market. Unfortunately, the faces only have very limited expressions. To make the facial expressions of the figures more varied, I used hats from Hornet. The combination of these two manufacturers allowed me to create very individual and characterful figures. For the hands, I opted for resin hands from Royal Model. These offer an incredible level of detail and allow a natural representation of the fingers. To complete the equipment, I used photo-etched parts to recreate small details such as buttons and carabiners. Before I could start assembling the figures, I had to remove the mold lines. To preserve as much detail as possible, I worked very carefully with a sharp knife. In some places, I used a small saw to restore the original details of the figure. To make the figures more detailed and individualized, I had to make some modifications. For the World War II figure, I first removed all excess detail from the front of the uniform to create a clean base for more modifications. The resin hands and heads need holes, so I used my rotary tool to drill holes in the arms and torsos. To minimize dust while working, I used my dust extractor or sanded the parts in a low bowl of water. This allowed me to work precisely and keep my working environment as well as my lungs clean at the same time. Drilling the holes in the arms was a particularly tricky step. This is a modification that is often neglected, but it gives the figures significantly more dynamism and realism. However, this work requires extreme precision. With the wrong angle or too much pressure, you can quickly damage the arms. Once all the individual parts were prepared, I was finally able to start assembling. I deliberately varied some of the poses by assembling certain parts differently than in the original instructions. For example, I placed the legs of the machine gunner at an unusual angle to create a more suitable pose for my scene. I then had to saw off any protruding parts. To securely connect the parts that didn't fit together on their own, I drilled small holes to reinforce these parts with wire and superglue and bring them into position. I paid particular attention to the machine gunner. In order to depict his Sappenpanzer in even more detail, I again punched out rivets from aluminium foil. With these tiny components I was able to realistically reproduce the details of the armor. I also made the flexible plates at the bottom of the armor from aluminium foil myself, to be able to dynamically adapt them to the pose as well. For the heads of my figures, I chose a combination of Hornet heads and John Smith Modellbau helmets. The John Smith Modellbau helmets are, in my opinion, the most realistic representations of the German M16 steel helmets. To illustrate this, I'm showing an original display piece of a M18 steel helmet. The only difference between the M16 and the M18 helmet is the attachment of the chin strap. As you can see, the shape of the original helmet bell and the small replica are almost identical. In order to be able to join the facial expressions of the Hornet heads and the helmets of the heads from John Smith Modellbau, it was first necessary to cut the heads off the helmet. That's why I first cut them off and then hollowed them out under the water with my rotary tool. Then I cut off the forehead parts of the Hornet heads above the eyebrows and ears. As a guide, I looked at the dividing lines of other figure models. Then I combined the helmet and heads. I put the steel helmet on a machine gunner the other way around. This technique was often used during the First World War, especially when shooting while sitting or lying down, to allow the soldier to lean his head more heavily on his neck. By turning the helmet around, the soldier could tilt his head back, which would otherwise be made more difficult by the long neck shield of the M16 helmet bell. Even though my machine gunner is depicted standing up, I wanted to include this detail. To complete the helmets, I made chin straps from aluminium foil. I cut the foil into narrow strips and based their width on the original helmets from John Smith Modellbau. After cutting them to size, I carefully cleaned the strips before attaching them to the helmets. To make the chin strap even more realistic, I used additional pieces of aluminium foil to form the loop that is created when adjusting the size of the strap. Finally, I recreated the buckle with a photo-etched part. After the helmets were finished, I glued all the remaining details and parts of the figures that I had in mind for the figures. Among other things, I also devoted myself to the hands. The machine gunner's hand was particularly challenging, as it had to be firmly attached to the machine gun. In order to achieve a natural grip, I attached the hand directly to the machine gun and not to the arm to ensure that the hands really grip the machine gun and that the thumb also presses the button. Of course, I had to make sure beforehand that the hands would fit into the prepared holes in the arms. I used Magic Sculpt one last time to smooth out all the unevenness and gaps that resulted from the modifications. With this material I was able to remodel the finest details and fill in missing folds in the uniforms. The adaptation of the figure's uniform, which was originally intended for the Second World War, was particularly time consuming. Here I had to redesign the entire front to represent the uniform from the First World War. To give the figures an even more realistic touch, I finished by working the surfaces with a damp cotton bud. This rounds off the sharp edges a little and makes the figure's clothes look softer and more lively overall. To add the finishing touches to the figures, I used green stuff to model fine details such as the straps of the belt and binoculars, the leather parts between the segments of the Sappenpanzer and the shoulder marks. The green stuff shoulder marks also allow for much more customization. Before I applied the green stuff, I moistened the surfaces slightly as usual so that I could still position it after application. This allowed me to make the details very three-dimensional and give the figures an individual character. And finally, yes my friends, this concludes the construction work on my diorama. Despite the small scene, it was an elaborate project. In order to be able to continue realizing such time-consuming and cost-intensive projects, I want to announce that I'm going to open my Patreon channel. I will offer exclusive content there, such as detailed building instructions in the form of ebooks. However, I would like to emphasize that a Patreon subscription is mainly to be understood as support, but of course I'm going to offer special benefits for all supporters. In the next video I will guide you through the painting process of the figures and give you an insight into my color choices and techniques. I will also be introducing my first ebook for Patreon subscribers, which is specifically about painting German figures. In a third video I will show the painting of the diorama. I would also like to mention, as some of you might know, that I like to use music that fit the mood and the time period of the theme of the video perfectly. When watching the video, some of you may have wondered which music was playing in the background. It was an instrumental version of the Argonnerwald song. I first read about the song in the third part of Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front trilogy, when the protagonist's friend dies and he remembers this old soldier song which dates back to 1915. This song is generally considered to be very authentic, as it reflects the feelings of the soldiers at the front at the time and was written in the fighting units. In the years that follow it, it was rewritten by both the German Communists and the National Socialists and instrumentalized for their own purposes. Although the song is as good as forgotten today, the melody has survived to this day in some football chants. I would like to introduce you to a vocal version of the first verse that fits the video very well musically.
Argonnerwaldlied